scratching the surface.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to, I guess our second colloquium of the year, or third. Really pleased to have Adrienne Brown here this week, and Adrienne is an associate professor in the departments of race, diaspora, and indigeneity and English, and she's also the director of arts and public life. She specializes in American and African American cultural production in the 20th century, with a focus on the history of racial perception. Her teaching and research interests encompass critical race studies, architecture and spatial studies, American studies, and a lot more things. She's a Renaissance person. She's written a number of books that I think will be of interest to many of us here today. I'll just list some of them too. So, including Race and Real Estate in 2015, that rethinks the narratives of property and citizenship. She's got the book Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race in 2017, which received multiple awards and examines the skyscraper's profound impact on the urban landscape, the racial sensorium of city residents. And then her most recent book, which is the one that caught my eye because I didn't know about this and was really excited to see it. The Residential is Racial, a Perceptual History of Mass Homeownership, just freshly out in 2024. So I could go on, but without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Adrienne, and really look forward to your talk today. Welcome to the
Full room. Thanks for making time today. I'm not going to talk about my stuff at Arts and Public Life, but I just will put a plug in if you haven't been. Arts and Public Life is initiative housed under the Chicago Arts umbrella. We're in Washington Park. We have 4 amazing spaces. So if you're interested in Chicago urbanism, South Side, you haven't been to Arts and Public Life, follow us, check out our website, and come visit us on the Arts Block. Okay, so I thought before I talked about this project, it might be helpful to begin by situating that work in relationship to my first monograph, The Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race. So in that book, I consider how a range of figures at the turn of the 20th century imagine the skyscraper to potentially negate or muddle race as something to be read from the body or experienced by one's own body. So this project really looks like the early era of the skyscraper, the late 19th century into the early 20th century, when the tallest buildings, occupiable buildings, went from, let's say, 10 stories here in Chicago to 102 stories with something like the Empire State Building, and kind of recovering just the overall sensational drama of that change in scale, but specifically how that change in scale changed the ways that people literally thought they could see and have an experience with race. So the book recounts how Americans grappled with how race was to be read or might endure as a meaningful category in cities in which bodies were hard to see and therefore know, be it from the top floor of the skyscraper, where you get this kind of obsessive description of the way that bodies appear as ants, specks, dark spots that are kind of indeterminable from one another, or whether it be at the crowded streets at the feet of the skyscraper, where skyscrapers are producing new density, that it's also kind of having an effect of distorting the racial sign and people's surety about that they know who someone is just by looking at them. So I'm pursuing this story about the skyscraper. I make the case for thinking about how architecture more broadly is always shaping the perceptual life of race. So this new project, I'm kind of taking a pivot here from architecture to real estate, right? Like, you can understand architecture, but you also need to understand the thing that allows architecture to be built, to understand its particular effects on the force of race. So in the epilogue of The Black Skyscraper, I suggest that the afterlife of the story I tell there is less, I talk a little bit about contemporary skyscrapers and the way that race is still a part of that story, but I mostly suggest that to understand this story, the kind of most appropriate afterlife is the invention of the mass suburb at mid-century, helping to rescue whiteness as a perceivable and appraisable category from the urban, dense, vertical spaces that had threatened to erode its distinctiveness. So that's the story I try to tell in this latest project, The Residential is Racial, a Perceptual History of Mass Homeownership, focusing on how America's transition to becoming a nation of homeowners for the first time remade categories of race and, by extension, description and affect. The move to mass homeownership altered how Americans experience the neighborhood as a social, spatial, and most important for me, as a racial unit. So I'm going to start this talk. This first part will be just like some broad overviews of the project. And then the second half, I'll try to like activate some of that stuff through this specific idea of the residential sensorium and some examples. So just to give you a sense of the arc. Okay. So I'll start with this quote that has been the kind of animating quote was the animating quote for much of this project. It comes from Herbert Hoover's 1931 presidential address to the White House Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership, held in the wake of the Great Depression to spur new home construction and home purchasing. Despite the conference's social science emphasis, the president primarily turned to song lyrics in his address as evidence of homeownership's naturalness and necessity. And this speech was also broadcast, I think, on CBS radio. So this really did become a kind of national address that wasn't just this kind of industry field-wide address. Okay, so this is a quote. There is a wide distinction between homes and mere housing. Those immortal ballads, Home Sweet Home, My Old Kentucky Home, and Little Gray Home in the West, which were pretty popular songs in the late 19th and early 20th century, were not written about tenements or apartments. They are the expressions of racial longing, which find outlet in the living poetry and songs of our people. So Hoover goes on in this speech to wryly contend that, quote, Americans never sing songs about a pile of rent receipts, which is not true, before concluding that, quote, to own one's own home is a physical expression of individualism, of enterprise, of independence, and the freedom of spirit. By 1931, Hoover was a decade into his project of homeownership boosterism, which he first began as Secretary of Commerce in 1921. Following the housing shortages caused by World War I, and concerns about Bolshevism after the 1917 Russian Revolution, Hoover led the state to work alongside realtors and developers during the 1920s to zealously promote homeownership as America's greatest defense against social upheaval on the home front. This initial public-private partnership, setting the stage for the more extensive collaborations enacted by the New Deal, endorsed homeownership as not just a savvy financial decision, but an innate yearning at the heart of the American spirit. Although the mass foreclosures instigated by the Great Depression interrupted these efforts, Hoover's 1931 address finds the president nonetheless doubling down on his promotional rhetoric. But Hoover also insists, this is just to go back to that quote, that in his address, it also insists in his address that the sentiment for homeownership embedded in the American heart did not originate in America or with Americans, right? He doesn't call it an American sentiment, right? He calls it a racial longing that both precedes and supersedes the nation. Given Hoover's reputation at the time as a technocrat who waged war on waste and inefficiency, this is kind of how he got elected to the presidency, by this kind of heroic international work he had done to organize around keeping people fed during the war. His turn to affective evidence is somewhat surprising, but his turn to the more specific tenor of racial emotion alleged to animate artistic production from immortal ballads of the past through the living poetry and songs of our people is more inexplicable. Although other findings at this 1931 White House conference approached homeownership as a colorblind desire that should be attainable for all, there was a committee headed by Nanny Burroughs who was thinking about Negro housing, their charge is Negro housing, and their findings are really fascinating. Hoover's lyric symptomology of the racialized desire to own attests to the role that aesthetics, affect, and changing norms around racial perception were already playing and propagating mass homeownership in the US before the New Deal and its consequential embrace of redlining. While the notion that Black presence inherently lowers property values would become increasingly enshrined as the organizing principle of the American housing market, this alleged truism operated in conjunction with the less considered but no less consequential belief that whites' unquenchable hunger to own would endlessly propel property value from the yeoman farms of the past to the new residential plots of the 20th century. Understanding modern homeownership's organization around this notion of whiteness, defined by W.B. Du Bois in 1920 as, quote, the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen, is one of this book's key claims, or key aims. Its earliest chapters recover the case built for mass homeownership in the early 20th century, actively being constructed first by the professionalizing field of real estate, a lot of that activity taking place here in Chicago, before being adopted more broadly by the state, as it drew from centuries worth of theories defining whiteness as an innate desire for property and the inherent talent for its management, as well as limiting those outside of whiteness as insufficiently hungry for property or being incapable of its maintenance. Whites were not only more capable of managing ownership's complexities, such arguments went, but inherently valued ownership more fiercely than other races. As realtors and later the state built the case for homeownership in the early 20th century, this older rhetoric about the racial sensibility of property that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment shaped maxims of modern homeownership's field, as well as who was most suited to its repertoire. So that's one thing the book is trying to do, recover these much longer arguments about racial capacity and the ways that race and property emerge right around the same time as concepts coming out of the Enlightenment, and that those concepts were entwined from the start, and trying to kind of track those theories of the ways that race itself relied upon an understanding of who has a capacity for property, and tracing that longer philosophical settler colonial history. Think about how it shaped contemporary mass homeownership. It didn't just drop away, right? Like, where was that active theory meaning the drive for mass homeownership? This book, so that's one thing I'm trying to do. Secondly, this book tracks the way that the racial logic of homeownership drastically changed between the first decades of the 20th century through the mid-century. So while white Americans in the early part of the century, as historian David Freund notes, commonly talked about residential discrimination in terms of personal feeling stemming from hatred, discomfort, or perceived incapacity, like it was good enough just to say that I don't want to live next to X people because I think they're inferior. I don't want them to marry into my family, whatever it might be, right? By mid-century, that language didn't go away, but it had shifted. It was increasingly, residential discrimination was increasingly defended using an impersonal rubric of value, framing segregation as protection of one's financial investment in property rather than as a matter of personal amity. And yet, what is value but the enshrinement of feeling into the collectivity ascribed to the free market? As Keeanga-Yamanda Taylor puts it, quote, while people talk about the free market as this racially neutral colorblind space within which the invisible hand of supply and demand dictates what does and doesn't happen, such descriptions overlook the fact that, quote, the market is us. Older racial theories of property capacity were transformed and absorbed into financial truisms about Blackness's devaluing function that residents, realtors, lenders, and state agencies were quick to accept as fact by the mid-century, no matter how distasteful they claimed to find them in this liberalizing era. So kind of tracing that shift in the rhetoric of residential discrimination, even as the fact of it didn't change all that much, the legal mechanisms did change, and the rhetoric certainly changed to kind of absorb the more kind of Cold War liberal understanding of the necessity for inclusion that comes up against the idea, right? The unchangeable fact, as many in these fields often said and lamented about the fact of Black devaluation and its effect on property. So trying to think through that change and how that change in language happens. But perhaps the book's most central intervention is that in addition to tracing the racial logic that created mass homeownership and how it changed across the 20th century, the book most keenly charts how mass homeownership changed the perceptual norms and interpretive possibilities of race more broadly, and making how racial evidence was both located, described, read, and given meaning. While housing experts and activists have attended to the foundational role race played in the creation of mass homeownership, that this is just, I think many of you in this room probably know the scholarship, and this is just a tip of the iceberg of that scholarship, and I'm definitely indebted to and thinking with these scholars and more on almost every page of the book. But I think I'm up to something a little bit different. So while housing experts and activists have attended to the foundational role race played in the creation of mass homeownership, this book most insistently tracks the inverse, the role that mass homeownership played in altering the definition, perception, and value of race. The race looks different and is changed by mass homeownership, and trying to chart that change. As a residential emerged as a distinct spatial typology and by extension a way of life, codified through law, custom, academic research, and the economy, visions of the ideal residential subject also took shape. Unlike most typologies in the late 19th and early 20th century, the emergence of the residential subject was informed by scientific, philosophical, and aesthetic theories of race. Most keenly, those I just mentioned, positing ownership as a racial capacity of both intellect and feeling. But as the fever for homeownership took hold in the 1920s, aided by state incentives, and the home increasingly became the largest investment most Americans would ever make, imperatives to make race more cleanly legible and easier to appraise grew too. And this is a moment, I'll talk about this later in the talk, where if you ask someone in 1890 how many racial categories there were, you might get 3 and someone might say 63, right? This question of what is race, how to define it, where does it live, how to measure it, right? So such an active question in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in some ways, I'm interested in the ways that mass homeownership tipped the scales and changed the way that people were making those arguments about how race is defined, how to measure it, how to think about racial categories versus ethnic categories, et cetera. So while whiteness brought in to assimilate those once deemed on its borders, this is again a well-known part of this housing history. Italian, Eastern European, and Irish homeowners invested in whiteness by purchasing homes, requiring the exclusion of those deemed unfit to own, a category increasingly synonymous with Blackness as the century marched on. Whiteness was increasingly understood as not merely a trait belonging to specific persons, but as a trait belonging to a neighborhood and a neighborhood's most valuable amenity to be preserved at all costs, while Blackness was deemed illiquid, presumed to devalue all it touched, neighbored, or possessed. This transposition of race into equality of space changed what counted as racial evidence, as well as the methods for gathering, tallying, and appraising it. The visual apperception of whiteness and the fidelity of one's performance of it superseded hidden blood and invisible ancestry as useful racial measures within the bureaucratic systems developed to appraise home values via maps, forms, and what one could glimpse while driving through a neighborhood. So telling this story of homeownership, treating race not as a constant that's being responded to, but as a malleable concept continually being re-optimized by residential space and markets, entails reading the practices of realtors and bureaucrats alongside the work of writers and artists who are all collectively learning to newly represent the racial sensorium in the age of mass homeownership. Rather than understanding redlining as mere policy, naming the practice of devaluing certain neighborhoods in relationship to their racial makeup, I'm kind of more interested in approaching redlining as a mode of perception, as like a category of sight and sensation, altering what it meant to sense race and assign it value. Far from stable documents accurately depicting the racial makeup of neighborhoods, which sometimes I think these maps are read too literally, as if these maps actually correspond to anything empirically real around race. Or in some ways, these maps tell us more about what people thought race was in this moment and how to read it, right? And how to think about that part of these maps, right? Understanding them as projections of numerous subjective hypotheses about how race might be read and adjudicated on the scale of the block. Such an approach enables us to denaturalize the countless and often quotidian assumptions and interpretations about what race was and how to read it and value it, to recover the growing importance of neighborhood scale to race's perception, right? In the 20th century, the neighborhood matters so much to how people are thinking about what race is and how it works, which is very different than a century prior, right? Where the idea of the neighborhood and the scale of the neighborhood, because of where the invention of the neighborhood was as a scale, right, was in a different place. So I track how mass homeownership more fulsomely remade the rubrics of race from the early cases realtors made for its essentialness in the early 1900s through the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. So that's about the scope of the book. And this is the table of contents if you want to get a sense of what's in here. One thing I'll say that I didn't talk about, there's like a secret, not a secret, but a fourth thing that the book is trying to do across its chapters is also recover a larger archive and history of Black writers and artists and figures in particular who are trying to think about the Black attachment to land in particular. And then as the 20th century increases to home and property more broadly, right? What kind of an attachment is the idea of 40 acres and a mule as a project, and the ways that writers were both trying to like rethink that call for a certain kind of repair through property, but also questioning whether that form of repair is the only way to think about repair and rights and freedom. So that's another kind of thread that goes through this book. Think about different ways Black writers and authors are navigating property as a solution. Okay, so we consider race not as a fact marked and plotted by bureaucrats and realtors, but as a category being actively remade within the public sphere in accordance with the growing civic and financial value of residential investments. Both race and the residential appear less stable and more multiply constituted as a result, even as the racism perpetuated by these systems remained largely intact. To observe these changes, the archives for gauging the fluctuating measures of race and its alleged capacities must also shift, as well as our ways of reading them. Who had the capacity to be an ideal resident? How to best measure this capacity? And should ownership be the horizon of the good life, were inquiries being answered in affective and sensorial terms across a host of cultural, academic, and bureaucratic works. So novels, plays, films, and songs, magazines and newspapers, academic institutes, conferences, and journals of new disciplines like land economics and planning, again, many of which kind of had their early histories here at the University of Chicago, and professional and trade publications where realtors and appraisers honed and shared their craft. So this is the big archive of this book, and kind of moving across those archives to think about, again, a larger conversation that's happening about the residential sensorium, how you know it, how you describe it, how you count it. Cases made for and against homeownership relied on prescriptions about how homeownership should feel, what kind of perception appraisers should adopt when assessing a home's value, and the reliability of one's own racial sensorium in making judgments about the present and future worth of a neighborhood. Determining the value of a home or of homeownership more broadly, despite being draped in the language of the free market, relied on perceptual, aesthetic, and phenomenological evidence of race and its sensations exceeding discourses of empiricism or laws of value. Resituating residential discrimination as a key moment within the history of perception and aesthetics, as well as one of policy, demography, and democracy, we get an even more expansive picture of both its origins and its impacts. In the 20th century, neighborhood formation was also a mode of racial formation, and these mutual processes forged new norms for perceiving, marking, and measuring race on the residential scale. So that's like the big overview of what's happening in this project. So I'm going to try to give that some bones and some flesh. Okay, I'm going to start with this quote. There comes a time in the life of every normal man whose lot is cast in a busy city when he longs to get away from the bustle and confusion of the crowd. These words appear in the inaugural 1903 issue of, this is a very long title for a magazine, The Suburbanite, a monthly magazine for those who are and those who ought to be interested in suburban homes, published by the passenger department of the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Targeting insular New Yorkers who snidely wondered, can any good come of Jersey? The Suburbanite supplied a steady font of affirmative answers. While the magazine promoted New Jersey's specific appeal, its insistence that the normal man longed to live residentially, protected from commercial, business, and industrial districts, was finding broad application across expanding urban and suburban residential areas. So while the Suburbanite seeks to sell a specific form of living, the magazine in this time actually proved less interested in whether those it was trying to lure into central New Jersey own the homes they might come to inhabit, right? It's not about those who want to own their homes in suburban, interested in who want to own suburban homes, right? It's about an interest, right? And so let me talk a little bit more about why this would not have been framed as necessarily owning in this period. So when this inaugural issue was published in 1903, most Americans did not own their own homes nor necessarily desired to. This was, after all, decades before the emergence of mass suburban developments like Levittown, explicitly centering and selling the superiority of the occupant-owned single-family home. Though aspirations for the U.S. to be populated by property owners originated in Jeffersonian agrarianism up until 1920, less than half of Americans owned the property in which they lived. As more Americans moved to cities in the early 20th century, where they worked jobs outside of their homes, homeownership did not as readily appeal to their hearts, minds, or pocketbooks as owning land once had. The first large-scale private-public partnership to boost homeownership as being synonymous with the American dream would not emerge until the 1920s. Let me say a little bit about this map, because this graph is hard to see. So this is the homeownership rate in the U.S. starting in 1890, and you can see. You can see that the line is decreasing. It's not a massive decrease, but it is a steady decrease, right, over a few decades. And you can account for that decrease in a number of things, right? There was mass migration to the cities, people moving off rural land, immigration into the cities, and owning the land was very important, right? Because if you own the land, if you were a farmer, you own the means of production. For the most part, if you move to the city, obviously some businesses were operating out of homes, but most people were working outside of the home, wage labor in factories, industrial settings. So owning the home was not so much of an imperative from that point of view. And this was before, again, this idea that there was a kind of civic duty to own. All of that rhetoric wouldn't start until later, right? So the home was in some ways a financial option. This is the same moment where people are also thinking about investing in stocks in the stock market, right? So the home is one option of many investments one can make. And for an urbanizing America, the home is not necessarily the best or the investment that has most priority. Realtors really, and the kind of newly forming national guild of realtors starting to shape are noticing these numbers and thinking about how to make an intervention, right? How to boost these numbers. This is where the state starts to get involved in the 1920s. So the Hoover starts to get involved. We get the kind of home beautiful projects that involve a public-private partnership. The rate starts to go up a little bit, actually quite a lot. And then we have in 1930 where the rates go down again, the Great Depression. And then we have this zoom up, right, where the US becomes a majority homeowning nation for the first time around the late 40s, early 50s, largely in partnership with the New Deal. I mean, I think this is a very familiar story for many of us who've studied housing before. But what I'm most interested in this graph, again, is this like the crisis of this steadily decreasing moment where homeownership itself didn't necessarily feel like the inevitable future for the US. In fact, quite the contrary. And the ways that people kind of try to produce and rewrite the sentimentality as well as the financial associations with homeownership to change the course of that graph. Okay, so to go back to the suburbanite. Suburbanite was selling its readers not so much on property in this period or the owned home, but on the concept of the residential itself as a distinctive form of living where one lives away from the bustle and confusion of the crowd, as the magazine underscored, or the factory or the farm for that matter. Before the 20th century, where you worked largely determined where you lived. If you worked on the land, you typically lived on or near to that land. And before the age of cars and commuter rail, workers and managers alike tended to live close to where they worked, shopped, and played. The idea of the residential as a distinct spatial typology, and by extension, a way of life available to the masses, became increasingly codified in law, custom, and economy, starting in earnest in the early 20th century. As urban migrations drew more people off the land and into cities where they generally worked outside of the home, zoning ordinances emerged in almost every metropolitan area to disaggregate living space from working space. Lest we naturalize zoning's uptake, scholars have noted the distinctiveness of Americans' embrace of land use regulations compared to other nations. Enthusiasm for zoning in the US is even more puzzling, given its interference with the nation's other great obsession, individual property rights. Ernst Freund, an early scholar of municipal zoning, was one of the first to mark the, quote, peculiarly American passion for land use regulations in 1926, claiming Europeans were far more comfortable inhabiting multi-use neighborhoods. Quote, people do not mind a little store around the corner a bit. He notes that Americans, by contrast, had assumed the extraordinary sensitiveness of property to its surroundings, to the point that zoning now formed part of what he called the national temperament. This new temperament for zoning quickly revolutionized American residential life. The first comprehensive zoning proposals appeared in the US in 1905. And by 1935, most American cities and suburbs were fully zoned. So again, just imagining the swiftness within which zoning becomes a way of life. Before municipal zoning, Americans largely relied on covenants to regulate both usage and future occupation. Invasion was a commonly deployed term to describe the advance of both unwanted industry and undesirable people within residential space. As William Dean Howells observed, of householders fearful of the calamitous Irish in enclaves outside of Boston in 1871, quote, the encroachment of the Celtic army makes values tremble throughout that neighborhood. Where the Celt sets his foot, the Yankee rarely if ever returns. So this idea of kind of racialized has a much longer history than being yoked only to primarily to Black subjects as it would be as the 20s went on. Early private covenants combated encroachments. Early private covenants combated encroachments of all kinds, by restricting who a property could be sold to as well as its future uses. Building upon this tradition of covenants, municipal zoning worked to turn this patchwork of individual exclusions into district-wide laws. In addition to regulations around use, cities like Baltimore, Louisville, St. Louis all passed ordinances in the early 20th century sanctioning residential segregation by race, right? Where states said, well, these are Black districts, and really kind of saying these districts are now going to be organized by race. The Supreme Court overrules racial zoning laws as unconstitutional in 1917 for overly constricting property rights. And then racial covenants become the next best mechanism after those kind of citywide zoning laws become illegal. Racial covenants become the next best mechanism for maintaining segregation until they too were overturned in 1948. So you have this, I just gave you like a really quick run through some of the kind of big housing legal policy. So while zoning covered a whole host of nuisance uses, the failure of district-wide racial segregation ordinances to pass legal muster drove realtors, lenders, and residents to hone other procedural and perceptual strategies to maintain and profit from segregation, including covenants, redlining, contract buying, steering, the list goes on and on. But while a pig farm could be demarcated as a nuisance with relative ease, reading and adjudicating races on a spectrum of desirability at the turn of the century proved a more complicated matter. How does one determine which races were allegedly inharmonious within certain neighborhoods, to quote the Federal Housing Authority's early underwriting manual, and which could blend into the pre-existing racial symphony? Which assemblages of bodies could be assimilated into which racial and social units, and which combinations translated into discordant drags on value? As many scholars of housing and race of the racially harmonious to more firmly include those once located on the bubble of whiteness. Eastern Europeans, Italians, the Irish, and in some cases Jews who once resided on the fringes of whiteness became more decisively folded into this category in the 20th century as it expanded to accommodate those willing and able to invest in homes requiring acts of racial maintenance. So for instance, take the ranking of 16 racial and national groups by their influence on land values included in Homer Hoyt's influential 1933 monograph, 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago, which he wrote here first as a dissertation at the University of Chicago, and is often talked about as one of the most cited dissertations of all time. I don't know if that's true, that's like a Wikipedia fact, but it certainly has had influence. And so what we have here is a ranking that Hoyt reprints of a list of races, well, he calls them races and nationalities, who are ranked based on their effect on property value. So deemed most favorable to land values were the English, Germans, Scots, and the Irish and Scandinavians. Ethnicities compatible with Nordic definitions of whiteness favored at the time by white supremacists like Madison Grant and Northrop Stoddard, followed by a cluster of Eastern European nationalities and Russian Jews of the lower class located in this middle. And then ranked last as those exerting the most detrimental effect were South Italians, Negroes, and Mexicans. And then this is actually at the very bottom of the page. There's this little footnote saying this list was prepared by chiefly by John Usher Smith, West Side real estate broker. So like this list itself just comes from some guy on the West Side who's working in real estate, right? Like, and it takes this heft, I think, reprinted in Homer Hoyt's book, but so much of land economics and the ways that race was being theorized, right, did operate in this way, in this kind of casual movement of gossip, information, suggestion, because so much of appraisal in real estate is about how people perceive. It's not about the truth of perception. It is about how the people at the top of the list perceive those at the bottom, right? So in some ways, it is about what John Usher Smith thinks, like, does matter, right? And can be treated, even if it's gussied up and turn into like a kind of eugenics-like authority of science, right? But I write a lot in the book, right, about the ways that appraisal was trying to turn itself into a science evaluation that was reliant on forms of perception, as all empiricism is, but a particular way of kind of how individuals see bodies. Okay, so let me get back into this. So Hoyt's Boyd's labeling of these groups as both racial and national in nature suggests his lack of concern about the distinction between those two categories, very fraught categories still, right? But he doesn't really care about that, given its irrelevance for the purposes of valuation. Home values dependent on appearances rather than truth, the perception of something's worth now and into the future over scientific, empirical, or ontological claims about the nature of difference. Whether the distinction between a Czech and a Serb was racial or ethnic in nature mattered far less than how, again, those most valued at the top would rank those, would read and list read the bodies and behaviors of those ranked below. Because home values largely depended on the perceptual norms of white buyers whose desire to own was most encouraged and eventually subsidized by the public-private partnership managing the housing market, mechanisms of valuation altered the forms of racial measurement and definition deployed within the nation more broadly. Take here the early 20th century prominence of the one-drop rule as a racial measure based on the premise that any percentage of Black blood rendered one legally and socially Black. The one-drop rules were custom for and important to the continuation of enslavement, but they don't really become legally codified on bulk until the early 20th century with the rise of Jim Crow. And then you get one-drop rules that go on the books of almost every Southern state, trying to say exactly how much a percentage of white or Black blood made you X race. So this kind of specific interest in creating a legally accountable measure for race, right, becomes increasingly adopted in state legislatures starting in 1900. Within this formulation of the one-drop rule, if you've never heard of that, beholders of the body approached its surfaces as faulty barometers of race. Fair eyes and light skin that could allow someone to racially pass were not to be trusted given their potential to mask lineages undetectable through the external body itself. But the one-drop rule's skeptical approach to appearances were incompatible with the appearance embracing modality of home valuation. So whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, right, knowing who your people were, right? Who is your great-great-great-grandfather? If they're Black, you're Black. It doesn't matter what you look like, right? Your surfaces are not going to tell us the truth of who you are. It is about a hidden metric of blood that will usurp physical appearance, at least in the court of law, and given the popularity of narratives around passing in this period, right, and a kind of broader civic and cultural milieu as well. And mass homeownership intervenes and disrupts that. Mass homeownership incentivized a mode of racial accounting that relied on exterior perception as a good enough index of value. And fiction proves instructive in this regard. In the 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, if you know it, hopefully this is a readily available reference, but if not, I will give you some handholds here. So in this novel, homeownership could not yet make Jay Gatsby appear fully white in the eyes of his Anglo-American neighbors. The racial taint of his origins is the non-Anglo James Gats with the Z. So this idea that Gatsby is this racially passing figure, right, is an argument that literary critics have been making about Gatsby for some time. He anglicizes his name to become James Gats. And part of what gives him away in comparison to his wealthy neighbors is his obsession with the trappings of homeownership to kind of say, look, I'm really white because look at my home. Whereas the wealthier and overtly pedigreed Buchanans and Caraways can live anywhere and in any way without their whiteness being called into question, Nick, his confidant, after all, rents a cottage squeezed between two huge places while the Buchanans flit from residence to residence. Gatsby needs every sign he can fashion and every gesture he can muster to attest to the lineage he has manufactured to distinguish himself from the racial others who taint his claims to whiteness in that book. But his desire for such a literal representation of white roots, and if you read the novel, one detail is that he buys this kind of feudal looking mansion that is so feudal that the original builder had asked the homes around it to have thatched roofs to really look like a European feudal manor, right? And so like the literalness of the ways that Gatsby's home is embodying a certain kind of understanding of whiteness in this period, I think is really important to this book. Like his desire for such a literal representation of white roots ironically amplifies his unverified family history, as most of the characters in the novel remain more interested in his last name than the pitch of his roof. When Tom Buchanan attends his first party at Gatsby's, he sneeringly proclaims, quote, "I'd like to know who he is and what he does," insinuating that Gatsby's house is not enough to vouch for his character, or as other critics have argued, his race. And this is in fact what happens to Gatsby, right? He can't marry Daisy. This racial taint, his people not knowing who they are, right, becomes too much of a risk for her. He ultimately dies a pretty tragic death without being assimilated into the whiteness he had so much strived to be in that novel. In 1925, racial value is not yet fully yoked to residential value. Known heredity trumps residential occupation as the more valued site of racial identification and information. But by the 1950s, the fictional banlieue of Shady Hill, imagined by a writer like John Cheever, hosted an assortment of Gatsby-esque residents and past, Gatsby-esque residents whose past and lineages remain strategically uninterrogated as long as they look and act the part of white homeowners. As we move into the mid-century, neighbors did not actively hunt for undisclosed ancestors hiding within a resident's bloodline. Performing whiteness was good enough, even as both the appearance and performance of whiteness itself was being altered by mass homeownership. So in Cheever's short story, he's often heralded as like the father of suburban literature. He wrote for the New Yorker. In some ways, he kind of set the aesthetic tone and the model for how people were thinking about what the suburbs were and how they looked and what it meant to experience in them. And in these short stories, there are tons of characters from moving in and out of the suburbs, all of whom moved to the mass suburbs from elsewhere, which is previously the hallmark of the passing novel, where characters come and you can't prove who they are, but they all move somewhere. They all move somewhere where their ancestry can't necessarily be verified, and no one is asking around. No one's saying, "Hey, nice to meet you. I'm your neighbor. Who is your great great grandfather?" Because in some ways, if you moved in, if you got the realtor to take you to the space, and you got the mortgage, and you had invested, and you're there, and you look the part, it's to everyone's benefit, financial benefit, right? That you stay in whiteness and we're all good together, right? And so there's a different kind of, again, approach to what race is and how to think about it that is incentivized by the financial mechanism of mass homeownership to differently think about what whiteness is based on the investment that people were making in their homes and the ways that the neighborhood scale itself was mediating those relationships. So the mid-century homogenization of whiteness allowed neighbors, lenders, and appraisers to assess more quickly those deemed to fall short of it. As one Chicago realtor described of white home seekers in 1955, just the sight of some colored while driving on a block led them to decide they didn't want to live in that neighborhood. No conversation, interview, or interrogation necessary. One didn't even have to stop the car, right? So like this idea of kind of a deep knowledge, right? Doesn't matter, right? You're just driving through and you're like, that's not the neighborhood I want to live in because I see who lives there. So all the evidence one needed to assess the value of a neighborhood could be gathered in motion through the windshield. Homer Hoyt's ranked list of 16 becomes increasingly simplified by the mid-century as mass homeownership assimilated many of those once distinctive groups into whiteness and inflated the peril associated with those who could not visually pass. Blockbusters would, in turn, learn to manipulate this glimpse-driven form of residential observation, sending identifiably Black plants into white neighborhoods to scare homeowners into selling cheap. So the kind of legendary story of this is where Black women were hired to push baby carriages through white neighborhoods to scare white homeowners into thinking that there was a Black invasion. They would sell cheap. Developers could swoop in, blockbusters could swoop in, buy cheap, and then sell at an incredible markup to Black homeowners. So that example is so interesting and useful to me because it's theater, right? It's like the sensitivities of racial perception are so easily manipulated and triggered, right? That these blockbusters can literally stage performances of Blackness with these huge economic consequences. Another thing that they would often do is hire Black people to call white homeowners in Black voices, and again, look for people. So like, again, all of these different kind of racial masquerades that blockbusters, who are, I think, some of the most accurate readers of the housing market, right, could say, oh, only the sign matters. So we're going to play with the racial sign and get people to trigger those surface sensitivities. Okay, so by mid-century, if someone appeared white and was willing to commit to preserving white occupancy, then with only a small down payment, whiteness and homeownership could be theirs. Social definitions of whiteness organized by visual apprehension trumped legal definitions rooted in blood in the mass residential areas emerging in the post-war US. Almost everyone who moved to new suburban neighborhoods in particular were from somewhere else, their ancestry unspecified and unverified, as they journeyed along the path to homeownership paved by federal subsidies. As the owned home became the most prized wage of whiteness at mid-century, the measure of whiteness adjusted to better suit its recent expansions, as well as to more sharply police those who remained excluded from this category and its benefits. I'm not going to talk about this. I have a lot to say about Norman Rockwell, so you can ask me about it in Q&A if you want. But just notice that there is a person up in this window who is looking out. So there's like a real interesting exchange of gazes and perceptual apparati that are happening in this image. I think pretty famous Norman Rockwell image that I think in some ways speaks to some of this, but I can talk about that later. The other thing that I do talk about in the book is that there was just an explosion of writing about the neighborhoods, of representing, trying to capture what was happening on the neighborhood scale, both like professional appraisal manuals and maps, but also popular writing and visual culture, focusing on how to newly see in residential settings. So this outflow of residential description, I argue, was driven by the efforts of bureaucrats, appraisers, and artists alike to give form to the changes happening around racial perception occasioned by mass homeownership. So many writers, right? Writers who are just known for writing fiction, take a break from fiction to write these pieces of reportage about neighborhoods. So part of what I'm trying to do in this project is like take that writing and try to understand it in this larger context of this mass pressure to describe and define and newly assess, not just the residential, but what it meant to newly see in these settings, and think about all of this material, not exactly in conversation directly with one another, but shaping a larger conversation about residential site. As homeownership began to rival and ultimately supersede land ownership as the American ideal, the residential emerged not just as a place, as a space, but as a subjectivity and a form of site. Enter once more the suburbanite. So we'll go back to that magazine. So building from William Dean House's diagnoses of the sensitivities of householders, the magazine focused not only on how residential spaces could ease the nerves and pocketbooks of urban Americans, but remake their very habits of occupying and sensing. And its interest in limiting the residential sensorium recurs across its early editions. An issue from 1905, for instance, quotes at length from an interview with distinguished resident of New Jersey, inventor Thomas A. Edison, on city life contrasted with suburban life. So this is a quote from this interview with Edison. You probably know it's the inventor of the movie camera and many other things, right? So Edison derided urban living, insisting that, quote, our senses are too acute for the life of the city. Claiming to be, quote, thankful for my deafness, whenever forced to venture downtown, Edison longed for his vision to be similarly dull. Quote, if the eyesight would be blunted a little so that we would not have so many useless impressions recorded in the brain, it would be well. This is astounding, right? This is the man who invents the movie camera, who's saying cities are so overwhelming. I'm glad I can't hear it. I wish I couldn't see. Edison's comments ostensibly yoke the movie camera and residential living as modern techniques for mediating the devastation wrought upon the senses in the industrial age. The movie camera and the residential alike modulate the overwhelming number of useless impressions threatening to overload the brain in urban space. Edison's insistence on the suburbs' perceptual superiority echoes the sentiment of another suburbanite article called The Camera in the Suburbs, published a month prior. As this article claims, one needn't trek to the Rockies or the Adirondacks to find scenery worth filming, for, quote, even the exceeding small fry of the suburbs make pictures that are curious and even valuable. The lower density and open air in the suburbs, this writer continues, allowed for a different relationship to perception to emerge. Photography, instead of a diversion or excitement of an occasional trip, as in the city, soon becomes a habit in the suburbs, or even a necessity. The article concludes by pointing to the talent featured in the magazine's own pages. The Suburbanite has, from its first issue, been illustrated with productions of amateur photographers in the suburbs depicting homes and home life architecture and decoration, sylvan retreats and picturesque roads, cottages, palaces, repose and action, always clearly, artistically, and in a way to expound the charm, completeness, and sanity of suburban living. But what is not featured often in these amateur photographs of the suburbs published in Suburbanite are pictures of people. Bucolic images of glens and streams proliferate within the magazine, as do stately images of houses and tree-lined streets. More occasionally punctuating this publication are rarer images of hard-to-make-out figures on beaches in lush gardens or rowing canoes. Such images market the residential as a place where dwellers do not have to expend much energy making out people or faces. There are no masses of strangers to negotiate, only scenic milieus containing a few lone users immersed within pastoral surroundings. By subordinating images of sociality to those of manors and meadows, the Suburbanite frames the residential as a space where strenuous acts of social adjudication and racial delineation are not necessary. Gone are both the useless impressions recorded in the brain that Edison described, but also the stress of needing to sift through those impressions to ascertain the useful from the useless, emanating from the continual rush of bodies in growing urban spaces. The magazine frames the residential as a place that minimizes sensory input and thusly frees up the perceptual apparatus for less taxing pursuits. Whereas density, urban migration, and immigration scramble the racial sensorium within crowded urban centers, which is something I talk a lot about in the Black Skyscraper. I talk a lot about this image in particular from the Loop from 1909 and the different ways that the skyscraper was one of the agents kind of creating the perceptual difficulties that the urban was facilitating through density, through vantage point, that, you know, feeling like you could read and interpret the racial sign, right? That process, right, is always being mediated by the built and social environment, and how to take account for the ways that architecture is playing a role in kind of the racial and urban crisis of this period. So I talk a lot about that in the first book. In contrast, the residential sensorium is framed as a contrasting site of relief where one's senses would not be perpetually stressed by growing vertical vantage points, dense microecologies where smells and dialects intermingle, and the work of reading bodies, faces, and comportments to determine who one is encountering. I'm almost close to the end here. So while the Suburbanite's 1905 depictions of residential living's diminished perceptual demands vis-a-vis racial difference preceded later surges to these areas facilitated by mass homeownership, such a vision would continue to anchor representations of its most idyllic state. Lending institutions and realtors, moreover, would come to shoulder even more of the residential labor of racial discernment in the mid-century, assessing home seekers in offices and through loan applications before their presence on the block had the opportunity to disturb its perceptual milieu. So while few photographs of people appear in the Suburbanite, we do find brief racial portraits in its articles, suggesting which kinds of people were most temperamentally fit for residential living, while underscoring the importance of racial maintenance to the ongoing security of these spaces. Articles underscore the urgent stakes of suburbanization for the survival of Anglo-Saxon blood. The author of The Apartment House and Race Suicide warns against apartment living's, quote, deterrent influence on the multiplication of the species, as well as how such dense occupation may lead to, quote, the conversion of the race to methods of living that are not consonant with the teachings of the fathers. Apartment living threatens to erode these teachings, this author warns, by increasing, quote, the number of derelicts on the sea of life, leading to more bachelors and more old maids, more working women, more individuals unmoored at large from family. The future of white reproduction, the author warns, rests on residential communities steering its occupants towards traditional family structures. As another article in the Suburbanite more bluntly puts it, quote, there was no race suicide in the suburbs. Historians and social scientists continue to reveal the extent to which racial policies and theories shape almost every aspect of residential life in the 20th century, but these histories focused on policies and procedures have not fully captured how the project of mass home ownership in discrete residential spaces fundamentally altered how Americans perceived full stop, but especially in relation to race. Becoming residential was also a form of racialization. And as is always true of processes of racialization, determining what counts as a race, who counts as which race, what measures of race prove most useful in which contexts are always more erratic processes than we often acknowledge, even when they reproduce familiar structures of racism. if race is, on the one hand, the story of visual habits, sightlines that allow the national popular to prescribe common sight, to cite race scholar Matthew Goodall, and, quote, in property, vision and visual metaphor are essential modes of persuasion in the ways that human beings think they can and should interact with their environment, as legal scholar Carol Rose observes. I hope to chart the ways that property helps determine which racial sightlines advance and which recede in any given moment, as well as the extent to which property's power to persuade relies upon its imbrication with racial sight. That's it. Yeah, happy to take questions. I know some of you might have to peel out in like 4 minutes, but I'm happy to stick around a little longer. Yeah.
Okay, so throughout your whole talk, which by the way was like one of the most mind-blowing thoughts I've heard in 5 years.
Thank you.
The whole time I've been thinking about the quote you have from
Yeah.
my question has been why did he drop the word racially in it?
Yeah.
And you made it very clear throughout your talk that this was a social movement that was quietly happening.
Mm-hmm.
But were there like particular people speaking in his ear?
Yeah.
And then secondly, did it even matter whether he said it or not, if this was the trend all along?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is exactly why I'm obsessed with this quote. All of those questions were like, what is going on? Why did he say racial? Like, he could have said anything else. Why say it? Why say it in this address to this audience? Like, these are exactly the things where I was like, oh my gosh, if I know this, I think I'll know something about this history I didn't know. So there's a lot to say about Hoover. Hoover's got a really interesting history. He's in one of the first graduating classes of Stanford. He studies geology, he becomes a mine manager. So he's moving all across the world, managing mines in China, Australia, basically every continent. Hoover is there. And what he's doing there is doing forms of racial management, right? He's writing these treaties about which workers are good workers, which workers are not good workers, right? So his idea of a kind of racially deterministic capitalist market, right? He's doing that long before he becomes president. So some of that is in the background here. And I think more broadly here is a larger language that Hoover's language, you find so many iterations of the same language in the first 2 decades of the National Real Estate Board's journals that are coming out of Chicago. And so many of them are about making a kind of civilizational claim about properties utility that are often not using racial longing, but talking explicitly about an Anglo-Saxon, particular Anglo-Saxon tie, genealogical tie, cultural tie, but often also blood ties to a certain kind of commitment to property that other races do not have. So you see realtors, appraisers, all the people who are reading these trade magazines, they are explicitly using this language of race. And it's proxy, like it's more specific things. Mostly they're talking about Anglo-Saxon blood. So that language is definitely circulating. And by 1931, that guild is already shaping all of the outcomes. They'd already partnered with Hoover for a decade. So you find some of the things in the speech come exactly from that journal. And so what's behind that racial longing is this more specific thing around the discourse of real estate that's emerging both as a professional field, but also as an academic field. So it's drawing from eugenics, it's drawing from land planning that's being authorized by places like the University of Chicago, but also even this longer moment, right? Late 19th, early 20th century moment of settler colonialism organized around the idea of white diaspora. That's also kind of taking shape between like the 1880s and Woodrow Wilsonism in the 1920s. So there is like all of that historical backdrop that gets you to this like brief throwaway around racial longing that I think encodes all of this other thinking. So thank you. Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. It's a really fascinating talk, and thank you for taking the time to come and do it. I'm interested in this thing on the other side of this, the apartment side.
Yeah.
It's obviously not your focus in the book, but
Yeah.
I might have imagined that the resistance to racial integration could be even more in an apartment setting, and if only because people are so much closer together. So if I really
Absolutely.
thought I was threatened by having somebody of a different race live near me, then it
Yes.
seems like maybe the apartment would be the worst possible place to allow this to happen.
Yeah,
And so I'm wondering, was it the case that racial integration was easier in apartment settings at this time? Or was it just that the logic of segregation was a different one? Like, what was going on
Yeah.
in apartments?
yeah, it's a great question. I have two answers, I think. I mean, one is that the logic of, let's just say, integrate residential integration and discrimination changes a lot around between 1915 and 1920. This is the moment of the Great Migration. So actually before that moment, like in a place like Chicago, you would have Black districts, but it was also common to have Blacks, whites, Poles, like all living on the same block, right? So the mandate for segregation was there. We see that in the William Dean House, but it wasn't as strong as it would become later on. And I think this has to do with the kind of investment that homeownership is, right? Like with homeownership and the access of homeownership to a much broader mass than it could have been in the late 19th century. And one thing I didn't talk about is that part of what made homeownership difficult before the 1920s is that the financial structure of homeownership was much different. You didn't have the 30-year mortgage. You had 5 to 10-year mortgages you had to renew, and the down payments were almost 50%, if not higher. So that it was, a lot of people were locked out of the homeownership market until some of the reforms of the 20th century. But I think it's like, if you live in an apartment building, you're not financially invested in that space, right? So you can live there, and some of that personal amity might be part of your decision, right? But it's not the financial pressure is less, right? But if you own and you're worried that if someone Black owns and moves in next to you and your property value is gonna sink, right? You have a different, I think, financial commitment to protecting the space, right? And the fiscal value of that space. So there are two things that are happening that there's that financial investment is weaker in the 19th century in terms of this racial determinism around property values that is emerging in this period. Because you're right, like there's this great fetishization of apartment living by many, by many feminists who said communal living is the way to go, right? Like the only way we're going to get free is we get rid of the home and we all live in apartments and we have shared kitchens, and so there are lots of social theories that were being enacted by through the idea of the apartment as a different kind of space. But I think with the kind of attention and commitment that the state and the real estate guild start to throw behind mass homeownership in the 1920s, like the idea of apartment living itself starts to get, diminished as a civic idea. And so even that kind of mode of living, right, is shaped by these by the state throwing its might behind single occupancy ownership as the preferred form. I don't think I fully answered your question, but maybe I got the
No, I mean,
edges of it.
you almost did. No, I was just curious, like empirically, was there more integration of apartments?
Oh, that's, I see.
Dense, like were people with non-owner occupied districts of the city say than
Yeah.
owner occupied?
I mean, yes and no, but I think that the controlling factor here is that because there was a monopoly on in terms of Black housing in places like Chicago, New York, where Blacks would only live in Bronzeville or only live in Harlem, right? The housing prices were so much more expensive, right? Like African Americans in Harlem were paying almost double what Italians were paying in Greenwich Village because they had the monopoly. And so in some ways, no, because you couldn't even get in if you were Black between the 20s and the 40s, right? And if you were white and wanted to stay in a changing neighborhood, right? The prices were going up because people who own those properties could double and triple the prices of rent because they knew that Blacks had nowhere else to go. So that's not an empirical answer. Like I'd have to check that against the statistics, but that's part of what I think is shaping that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you say a little more about the Rockwell painting? I'm curious what you read in that.
Yeah, sure. Let me go to it. This is an interesting moment in Norman Rockwell's career. This is kind of later in his career where he's shifting to more civil rights, political paintings in this moment. He had become the kind of house illustrator for this magazine called Look magazine, which already tells you something about its values and what it thinks matters. It's a competitor to Life magazine. Life magazine, it was very image heavy. So the idea of Look was like, if you can look at something differently, maybe you can change people's minds, right? Like that revelation, right? And illustration, right, is a key for changing hearts and minds. And so in this painting, you kind of see that in some ways in action, right? Like most of the readings of this painting is about thinking the kind of hopefulness of this potential interaction. Like they're looking at each other, but they're curious and leaning in. There are more things that unite them than divide them. Like she's got a pink bow and she's got a pink bow, and they both have gloves. And like they have a black dog and they have a white cat, like they're kids. So eventually, like no matter what's going on, like they're the things that kind of bring them together are gonna overcome their differences or something. Like that is one way of reading this painting. Like it's this kind of optimistic thing of children, let the children figure it out. Like they don't know color or whatever. But I'm super interested in this person in the corner who, if you kind of track their sight line, they can't actually see this full scene, right? They can't see this moment of hopeful integration, right? What they see and what the housing market would have seen in this moment is Black invasion. So in some ways, their sight is completely occluded of this like optimistic potential moment, and they're inhabiting, I think, in some ways, what the actual like structuralist sight of the real estate market was that, you know, what's actually going to happen in this neighborhood is that this neighbor is going to sell. And sell at a loss, and a Black family is going to move in at great cost, and this neighborhood will change over in a matter of a few years, right? Which was actually the majority of what happened on the residential scene, even though there was great interest. I have a chapter where I talk about like how popular images and scenes of integration are in this moment. Lots of novels, images, right? That this idea that like there's so many middle brow novels in this period where it's just like, we just move in and we figure it out, we'll get it together and it'll be okay and integration will happen. But if you actually look at what happens, yeah, integration does happen, quickly followed up by resegregation, right? And so that's part of what I'm interested in this image is kind of this scene in the foreground, and then what this homeowner in the back is seeing, and these ways that these different kind of forms of perception are shaping things. And the other thing that I kind of write a lot about in this book is the way that this kind of idea that if you just look more closely at cities, you just look more closely at the problem, right? That will bring the change. Like this Jane Jacobs idea, I write a lot about Jane Jacobs in this book, and track her own racial sight and the ways that she sees race in Death and Life of American Cities, and how much that idea of like, if you just look closer at scenes like this, that's how we'll change things, was actually not the case, right? Like to change the scene, you don't need to look closer at this scene. You need to go to City Hall. You need to go to the bureaucrats who are behind the scenes creating the conditions for this scene. So like, what is the legitimacy of actually looking and changing hearts and minds when the story of residential segregation was becoming so structural, bureaucratically operated and secured, far from the block itself. So these kind of dueling pressures in this moment where some people are saying, look more closely, if we just look better at cities, we could solve these problems. And then people in the Black Panther and the Black Power movement were saying, actually, the issue is not about looking more closely, right? There's a different structural issue that has to be addressed that isn't about changing individual hearts and minds. It's about some other form of structural change. That's a long answer to your question, but yeah, I love looking at this image. Yeah.
This was extraordinary. I want to also ask about this because it's my understanding that this is based on a supposed interaction in Park Forest, which is in the south suburbs of Chicago.
Yes, that's true.
Which was also sort of supposed to be one of the first kind of racially integrated suburbs right in this post-war space, and it sort of became a model for thinking about racially integrated suburbs. And I believe Nixon came out to visit. And so I'm just curious if you actually engage with Park Forest as in this way, right? Considering that it's right here, suburb of Chicago. So I'm just curious if you actually talk about that.
Yeah, I don't. You should, because you're totally right. Like this is an illustration that comes out of exactly, and there are several articles in this issue that were about Park Forest, and you know, like the Chicago suburbs are just at the front of so many of these stories in this period, right? Deerfield, Trumbull Park, right? You know, like this is just, you know, one of many epicenters, but I think it becomes a different kind of epicenter too, because it is also like the bureaucratic home of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers and Boards. And, you know, Chicago is such an important site of knowledge for them in relationship to the University of Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, that it's no coincidence, I think, that Chicago continues to be an important part of the story. And the last chapter of the book, I write about Martin Luther King's Chicago campaign, and some of the kind of major failures of his housing campaign in Chicago, and why he fails in Chicago when he has success in other places, right? And thinking again about what about Chicago could King not quite mobilize and get right to be able to like he might have never been able to do it given the difference of the structural issues of race in the South versus the North, but he makes some key choices around how to represent that campaign that I think are kind of like were bad choices, but that's a whole other thing. But yeah, thank you for that question. I think, like tying this piece more directly to the context in which it comes out of, like, must be done.
Yeah, I would love to just talk more with you about that, because Park Forest is such a fascinating, has a fascinating history. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hi.
I love your book so much, and I just want to know more, I guess, about the choices that you made and had to make about what to include.
Yes.
How did you decide which text to talk?
Yeah, that is always my problem. As you can tell, this is a very interdisciplinary project, and inclusion is always an issue. So, like, how did I do it here? I'm gonna go over my table of contents and remind myself how I did it. Here's what I tried to do is try to think about different questions that are animating each chapter, and think about which sources are going to help me answer that question, no matter what their disciplinary, no matter what genre or field or home they come from. So for instance, like in this chapter 2 on the rent party, I begin with all of this real estate stuff I've been talking about in the journals about Anglo-Saxon blood, and property is key and king, and then thinking about the rent party as a site where people are throwing parties in the 20s and 30s in places like Harlem and Bronxville to stay housed. So understanding, okay, well, if people were actually singing songs about a pile of rent receipts counter to Hoover, what are they thinking about in those spaces, and how do I make sense of that? The problem there is there were no recordings of rent parties. They were sweaty, they were hot. This is before the time people have phones, could just take pictures. So then I'm like, well, how do I tell that story? And so then I had to find newspaper stories and articles and theatrical plays, and all these other things that are going to help tell me that story about how people, how the rent party created a kind of scene of dispossession, even as people are trying to stay in their housing. So like part of it is like, okay, this is a question. This question seems important for understanding something here. And what are the things I need to gather to answer that question? And not even start with like, what's the literature doing? What's happening in this journal? But just say like, how can I create if I have all of these things as part of the conversation, what story starts to emerge? So it's like privileging the question over, like, let's say my own training as a literary critic. Do you want to go straight to the novels, right? It's like, so they're all telling stories about race, whether it's a form that the FHA scripts people to fill out versus a play. And so just trying to think about those different ways that people are being scripted to think about and write and respond to race across lots of different genres. So I don't know if that was your question, because I think yours was more specifically about selection.
That was
Okay.
great.
Anything else?
Thank you.